This is Max. This is Max. Max. This is Max. This is Max.
We've been talking about COVID-19 and remote work.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Product Drama Podcast. This is Max.
And this is Anatoly. For more than a year, we've been talking about COVID-19 and remote work. And I have to admit that Zoom online meetings in sweatpants and jackets became our normal routine.
So, will we ever return to the office or stay remote forever?
Our today's guest, Clement Kao, certainly will help us to clear these things up. So, hi Clement.
How you doing?
Hello, I'm good. Again, thanks so much for having me on the show. Really excited to be here.
So, at our company at CXDojo, we really went pretty smoothly through the lockdown period.
Mm-hmm.
And because one of the key values of our team is an ability to work remotely for all of the time. And how did it go in your company? So did this transformation from lockdown went smoothly, or it took a while to adapt to the normal things?
Yeah, great question. So first off, for those who don't know, I'm currently a product manager at Blend, and I'm also the co-founder of Product Manager HQ. And so that means that I can actually talk about it on two different dimensions. I can talk about it from the Blend perspective as an employee, as well as talk about it from PMHQ's perspective as a leader, right? So I'm going to first start from Blend, just because that one was the more difficult transition, and I'm more than happy to jump into PMHQ. So for Blend, you're exactly right. For a lot of organizations that didn't begin as remote first, it was actually somewhat difficult for us to get started. I think one of the things that we really value at Blend is we value a lot of the serendipity, a lot of the kind of in-person spontaneous interactions that you get between product managers, engineers, designers, account managers, right? Kind of having everyone all together really sparks a lot of that innovation, right? The innovation that Silicon Valley is so famous for. And so originally when we were thinking about going through the lockdown, I think a lot of us were in denial. We kept thinking, oh, it's okay, we're going to be back in just a month, right? It's just an isolated case. We'll eventually come back. And so a lot of it was kind of doing more of what we were already doing, but just remotely, right? So we would have all of the same meetings and they would all be through Zoom. We would still have our water cooler meetings, right? Like we'd still have our one-on-ones, kind of all remote. But one of the things that started creeping in was we started finding out that, the challenge with Zoom and the challenge with Slack, right, is that it requires you to be a lot more intentional about the way that you communicate. And, kind of before when we were in the office, right, you could just walk up to someone's desk and, based on your observations of, hey, are they busy or not? You could jump in there and say, hey, I really need your help, or hey, I want your eyes on this, right? And so it was much easier. When you were taking a break in the kitchen, someone might join you in the kitchen. And so you might be able to share ideas that way. But you can't really do that through Zoom or Slack, right? Like you have to be a lot more intentional and you have to actually go take that time from that person and have that scheduled. And so we started moving towards, a lot more of an intentional model, kind of rather than just relying on the strength of our own personal relationships, right? I think we started working together as a team in terms of what are the meetings that actually matter, right? Kind of when do we really need to sync up and how can we replicate a lot of that friendliness without necessarily having it be forced. Right? I think one of the challenges with Zoom is that only one person can speak at a time, right? You can't have, multiple people kind of chatting together in a large group. So I'd say like in terms of, how do we share information? I think we started moving a lot more towards asynchronous communication. So writing things down, making sure that each meeting had really clear agendas, right? So it was no longer acceptable to say, hey, I just want to grab you to talk for 10 minutes because you might be pulling someone out of their stream of thought, right? So we had to be really intentional about that. But on the flip side, we also had to be really intentional about hanging out, right? You can't just say, hey, everyone, let's sit in a Zoom together for an hour and watch each other eat, because that's just really awkward, And so we had to move a lot more towards like team events where like we could all kind of break up together. So the thing that worked really well for us is crossword puzzles. So basically putting people into multiple teams and then competing to see who could finish the crossword the fastest across the different teams, which was a lot of fun. As well as kind of, lots of icebreaker events where again, like we'd break up into smaller groups and kind of all talk together. So I'd say that for Blend, we are now past the point of denial, right? I think it's really clear that no matter what, we're going to continue seeing the need to work remote for a couple of different reasons, right? One, this isn't going to be the only pandemic, ever. There can be, other things that could happen, right? And so, just because we are addressing COVID-19 right now doesn't mean that there might not be another virus or another pandemic or another global situation that requires us to work remotely. And so we need to know how to work remotely, for one. And for two, one of the things that's really important is that we've learned that we can still recreate, a lot of the magic of the office. We just have to be a lot more intentional about it. And the really great thing about being able to work remotely is that, we now can access a lot more talent, right? I think before we kept saying, you have to sit in San Francisco because that's where all the designers and engineers and product managers are, right? And kind of we have to make sure that you're part of the San Francisco office because that's where all the magic is happening. But now that kind of everyone is split up all across the United States, we even have some folks that are working, from Europe right now. It's not as true anymore, right? We've learned that you don't have to have everyone in the same spot. And so that means that we can be a lot more flexible when it comes to looking for talent to work with. And kind of managing all of the collaboration that comes with having to work across time zones, work across geographies, et cetera. And so I'd say, we'll likely be returning to the office in some capacity, right? We'll likely be, it's pretty likely that, for product managers, we're probably going to show up back in the office maybe 2 to 3 days every week, right? We might be on some rotation schedule. We might come in when we decide we need to versus when we don't need to. The office is still going to be there because there are just some things that are a lot harder to do remotely. But it's pretty clear that, we will be continuing to work remote. I think one of the things that's been really amazing, right? So Blend is a business to business product company, right? Kind of we sell software to financial institutions like US Bank, Wells Fargo, et cetera. And before, the only way that we could work with our customers really was to fly out and sit with them in their conference rooms, right? And that would take a lot of their time. It would take a lot of our time. And now that everyone's so used to working remotely, it's so much easier to just jump in with our customers and really dig into, okay, so how is it that you're currently doing this work? Kind of what are all the different dependencies? Give us all of that context. How do we work together? And so that has actually accelerated a lot of our partnerships with our existing customers to build new products, which I think has been, really magnificent, right? We didn't really have that access before because kind of you had to keep flying out product managers and engineers out to the customer, and that's not scalable past some point, right? And so now we can kind of show up to customers whenever we need to and really partner together. So I think that has been really amazing in terms of Blend kind of evolving its stance on how we think about remote work.
How long did it take for you to work out the way to synchronize the efforts? I mean, every person has its own schedule, right? And one can work during the night, the other more of a morning person. How it's better to collaborate together? Did it take long for you to work out that routine?
Yeah, it took a while, right? And I think, again, part of it was because we were somewhat in denial. We kept thinking, oh, we're going to get back in the office. We're going to see each other soon. We're going to be able to hang out in person again soon. And so I think we originally didn't invest enough upfront time in terms of making that transition. But I think once we got past, let's say, around like the 3-month mark, it was pretty clear that we weren't going back for a while. And so by that point, I think that's when a lot of team leaders, right? So product managers, engineering managers, design managers started really actively digging into, okay, well, how are we going to make this work for the long run, right? Like we can't just keep pretending like we're going to eventually go back because it might still take a while and we still have a lot of work to do, right? And so I think from there, it probably took, another month and a half to really talk empathetically with a lot of our teammates to really understand, okay, well, where are you coming from? Kind of what are the needs that you have? What are the challenges that you face? And kind of how can we all organize around those? And so I think, now everyone is a lot more aware of each other's schedules. I think, we put up our time zones on Slack so that way people know, are you bothering me right now because it's the wrong time zone? People are a lot better at keeping their calendars up to date of like, this is when my day starts. This is when my day ends, right? People are a lot more intentional about, this is when I will get back to you on this thing that you've asked me, right? So kind of before you would kind of rely on bumping into a person and then checking in on their status when you bump into them. And you can't really do that anymore, right? And so I think it's been a lot more kind of, how do we want to make sure that everyone's in sync on what are the kinds of work that we're doing without necessarily making it feel like, we're micromanaging, right? So I think we've been leaning a lot more on stand-ups. So even non-development teams, right, like teams that are not building software have also moved towards this stand-up model where basically every day or every other day, kind of we will all sit down together and just talk through, okay, what did we do in the last 24 hours? What do we plan to do in the next 24 hours? Where do we get stuck? Kind of what are the challenges that we need people to help us with? And so I think, it took time. It definitely took a lot of experimentation and a lot of false starts. I think for the longest time, we kept thinking, oh, if we open up like a Zoom chat for a while, right, then that way people are going to be able to have fun and hang out, and it just doesn't work that way just because Zoom, only one person can talk at a time. So I think, we definitely had to iterate for a while, and we didn't really get to start iterating until we got over our denial. And so it took us a little bit longer than I think we would have wanted to. And in a perfect situation, I think we would have liked to begin that investment much earlier, but better late than never. Now I think we do have kind of the right organizational processes as well as the right teammate mindsets in terms of how we're going to work together remotely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, that's great. And Clement, can you give any tips or advices that helped you to become a successful remote product manager?
So I think one of the things that one of the things that product managers always have to keep in mind, right, is that we're always serving our customers, we're always serving our business stakeholders, and we're always serving our development teams, right? And I think before we moved remote, you could rely a lot on kind of in-person interactions to gain empathy for that person, but kind of you don't have that luxury anymore as a product manager, and so that means that you need to be a lot more thoughtful in terms of reaching out to people, but also making sure you give them space, right? And so I think one of the things that is underutilized in the product management toolkit is people don't schedule enough one-on-ones with engineers, designers, other stakeholders, really to get feedback on how can I help you, right? Like how can I better serve you while you're working remotely? What are the things that are challenging when you're working with me remotely, right? I think kind of before people might be able to give you kind of off the cuff feedback kind of while you're hanging out or you're chatting. But now kind of you need to give people that space to be able to say, hey, I really like the way that you're running this thing, but the way that you're doing this other thing doesn't really make sense. Or, hey, I think this works for other teammates, but I'm really struggling because X, Y, Z, right? You really want to make sure that you're taking the space to be empathetic and to understand where everyone's coming from so that you can modify your approach and work with them. But on the flip side, you also don't want to badger them with infinite meetings, right? Because just because product managers are typically more extroverted and more eager to meet doesn't mean that you should be interrupting engineers and designers when they're trying to have heads down work time. And so I think a lot of it is making it optional of, hey, I'm going to grab, let's say 30 minutes every 2 weeks, but just for us to be able to check in, right? So that way you can ask me any questions about the business, you can ask me any questions about projects, you can give me feedback about how I'm doing, what I can do better for you. But if you don't have anything for me, we can cancel, right? And kind of those one-on-ones are not meant for me to get status updates on initiatives. It's more for me to understand how can I better serve my teammates, right? And so I think that has been really incredible. The other thing that's also been really helpful, right, is keeping cameras on. And so, you gain a lot more empathy for people when you can actually see their faces and kind of see the way that they're interacting. But there is some danger, I think, to keeping cameras on all the time, because there's something that we all call Zoom fatigue, right? Kind of when you are watching your face all the time on screen, right? Like you get really tired, right? Kind of you're always sitting in the same position like this, right? Always facing someone. You can't like move around and talk to people. And so that's just really painful. And so one of the things that we started doing is, for one-on-one meetings, right? Kind of we ask the other person, would you like cameras on or off, right? And kind of it's up to them to decide, and kind of we'll mirror that. And then for team meetings, we'll say, hey, for this particular team meeting, right, like we feel comfortable just having everyone's cameras off because we already trust each other. Whereas if we're starting a new initiative, we ask everyone to put their cameras on just so that we can all see who's engaged, who's confused, how can we help people come up to speed. And so I think a lot of it is really soft skills, right? It's really understanding the other person and taking the time to be available when they need you, but not forcing yourself onto them, right? And I think that that is a very hard balance to hit as a product manager, because you're naturally going to be very antsy about, is this person on track with delivering this stuff, right? Kind of before, when everyone was working together, it was much easier to see the progress of how everything was moving, because you could just kind of walk by and kind of see how are people doing. I mean, I can't really have that, but you really need to resist that urge to micromanage or to give people too much pressure. You really want to make sure that you can trust them, but also make sure that they understand that they should be keeping you in the loop, right? Because it's a two-way relationship, right? Just because you're there to help them doesn't mean that they don't have to help you, right? So like giving them an understanding of hey, these are the things that I'm worried about, right? Like for this particular project, I'm really worried that if we don't get these kinds of designs on time, that we're not going to be able to make it, right? Or like, hey, I'm really worried that if our designs haven't been reviewed by engineering, that like they might not be feasible, right? And voicing those concerns kind of rather than trying to hold all of that back, kind of being a lot more transparent and sharing that context, I see has really helped my teammates be able to jump in more, kind of where they previously didn't have to because we had all those physical relationships, right? And so I think, I think, there's definitely, a lot of, there's a lot of very subtle things that you can do in terms of scheduling time with people and in terms of meeting etiquette that I think people don't think about as much as product managers, but you really need to lean on that as a remote product manager now.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you because really understanding and emphasizing your teammates is, I think, is a key way. So like, just it's only way to be like successful team for really making the job in a great way.
For us, the trick with camera actually worked, but we tried it to have always on cameras. But then some people started complaining, like, I didn't wash my hair today. Like, I'm not looking good. So we then switched to have like camera Wednesdays when everyone's like can prepare and wash be good looking and not worry about that. Okay, as we all know, in 2020, lots of businesses started paying more attention to their online divisions. Do you think that positively influenced the importance of product management, or people who cared continued caring, and people who didn't just did what they did?
I think, because everyone's been forced to work remotely and digitally, I think there has been a lot more emphasis on software products, right? And so one of the things that, we really saw from our own customer base at Blend is that, we saw a lot of our customers were very interested in accelerating their digital roadmap, right? I think one of the things that, I think a lot of banks or financial institutions used to think about, right, is it used to be, hey, I typically have my customers, my borrowers come into the branches in person, and I really want to focus on that in-person experience. And so kind of they delayed investing in that digital transformation. But now that it's so much harder to do things in branch, now that customers want to be able to do things whenever they want to on their own terms, we've seen a lot more interest from our customer base and our prospect base of, hey, we really want to move towards digital. And so kind of we've seen that there. And also for the customers who are already digital, they're seeing that, oh, shoot, everyone else is moving digital, right? Like we can't just, digital itself is not enough of a differentiator. We need to step ahead of the game. And so we now see that, there are a lot more conversations around how can we integrate various products together, right? I think the integrations roadmap has become a lot stronger, a lot heavier, just because there are so many more workflows that won't work unless you have your products all talk to each other, right? I think you might expect to see that a financial institution might have literally dozens of different vendors that they're working with to create that digital experience for their customers as well as for their employees. And you really need to make sure that all these things are working together, right? And so I think we see an increased emphasis in in that digital experience, that omni-channel experience where a customer can do anything that they need to online or over the phone or in branch. You see kind of that move to empower employees with digital workflows. So kind of rather than relying on, in-person paper, right? Or kind of waiting for people to fax you things. Now it's a lot more, how do we do all of this digitally? But you also see a lot more focus on how do we integrate together all of these disparate technologies so that they work seamlessly together, right? So I think, there is a lot more interest from various businesses of how do we move into digital. And I think that has been paralleled with an increased interest in software product management from an employee perspective, right? I think, Product Manager HQ, we've seen this incredible increase in interest of, what is product management, right? Like, how can I break into that? I think a lot of people are starting to see that, there's a lot of promise in terms of building out this digital software. And I think a lot of people, now that they have time, they don't have to be commuting to work all the time, right? Like you don't need to sit in your car and drive to work for 90 minutes and then drive back for 90 minutes, right? All the additional time, we see that a lot of people are investing in learning about product management, right? And so, that's been really incredible. I think I've been a part of a lot more webinars, conferences, articles on product management than before because, the pandemic really unlocked a lot of latent demand for how do I learn more about product management, right? Like now people have so much more time, they can go ahead and take that time to invest in learning more about products. So I'd say, both from a business perspective, businesses are very interested in moving towards digital, and that's probably going to stay even once the pandemic has ended, because digital unlocks all of these additional efficiency benefits, user experience benefits. And you see a lot of employees, a lot of people in the workforce also wanting to move into digital product management. I think kind of these trends are definitely here to stay. I'd say probably the global talent shift towards digital and towards remote has probably been accelerated by, let's say, 3 to 5 years. And I'd say kind of similar on the enterprise space. I'd say businesses have been moving along on their want to transform things digitally by about 3 to 5 years as well.
So I read your article that was dated August 2020 about the state of the product management during the pandemic. And how do you think, except for the passing denial stage in February 2021, did anything has changed since then? Because people are starting getting their vaccine, so we are moving towards like passing this pandemic.
Based on all the conversations that I've had with leadership teams, with product managers, with customers, I think even once the pandemic passes, there's not going to be a significant snapback, I think, to kind of past ways of thinking. And what I mean by that, right, is there's really the strong network effect that's now in place, where now everyone knows how to use Zoom, everyone knows how to use Slack, everyone knows how to work remotely, where previously they didn't. And I think one of the most insightful articles I remember reading was drawing the parallel between the telephone and Zoom. And what I mean by that is the telephone was actually invented, quite a while back, but it actually didn't have a lot of adoption because there was no point in you having a telephone if your friends didn't have a telephone, right? Like you had no one to call. And so it was only until, you started seeing this mass market adoption of people using telephones that, telephones became like a widely accepted medium of communication. And I think similarly, right, like, even today, even though kind of all of us have smartphones and we can all text, people still get on the phone to talk, right? And so like that's not something that has disappeared just because the situation has changed. And so I think similarly, now that we all know this new way of working, this new way of communicating, I don't think it's going to disappear, right? The volume will definitely decrease, right? Anything that goes from 100% to some other percent is definitely a decrease, but I don't think it's going to be this full move back towards like doing everything exactly the way that it was back in 2019, right? I think that is no longer possible because people have hired talent that work remotely. Like there is no way to bring them in. People work with customers in ways where there is no way to replicate that behavior if you go all the way back to 2019. And so I think kind of you're going to see this stickiness towards, moving towards digital transformation, moving towards remote work. That's unlikely to shift all the way back. There'll be a little bit of shift back, don't get me wrong, right? But it's not going to be kind of this full snapback towards what we saw in 2019. Just because I think there are now so many new patterns of working, so many new patterns of communication that have demonstrated their value. We're not going to see those get eliminated, right? And so I think the open question is not, I think really the open question, right, is like how much of this kind of shift to digital and shift to remote going to stick? I think there's no question that it will have some sticking power. I think it's more so, do you expect it to look like 90% of what it is right now, or do you expect it to look like 30% of what it looks like now? I think like really the question is in the magnitude and not in whether it will happen. I think a lot of folks pretty much agree that it will continue to stick. This is still going to be a very valid way for large companies, small companies, all sorts of organizations, all sorts of people to continue working. And I think people are not going to have really good excuses anymore to say, oh, well, I'm not going to work remotely, I'm not going to work digitally, because every company's been through it now, right? Like you don't have an excuse now to say like, oh, no, like we don't invest in like Zoom and we don't invest in Slack and whatever. Like you need to empower your employees to do the work that they need to do in ways where they can actually go do that, right? And so I think it'll stick. I think the open question is how much it'll stick. And I think that really depends on industry by industry and almost company by company, right? Like some organizations very much still prefer that serendipity of having everyone together, kind of that spontaneous innovation. And other organizations see so much cost savings in giving up their offices that they're not going to move back, right? And so I think it really just depends on people's appetite for how much they want to snap back to 2019.
What do you think will be the first businesses that will return to offices?
Honestly, I don't really have a good grasp of that because even when we say like a bank, right, like there are so many different departments that might perform better digitally versus in person. And so I think one of the things that is very interesting is, for a while, lenders were very concerned about moving their processors and their underwriters online, right? So a processor is someone who collects documentation to figure out, does this person qualify for the loan? And an underwriter is someone who looks at that documentation and decides, are we going to give this loan or not? If we're not going to give this loan, why not? And kind of how much are we going to give instead, right? And so in the past, these were all very paper-driven processes. And so lenders were very, very worried about moving processors and underwriters towards remote work. But as soon as they moved them towards remote work, they started seeing that people accelerated their ability to work. People were able to take on much heavier bandwidth and to do a lot more high performance work with a lot more accuracy and a lot fewer errors than when they were doing it in person. And I think that's because they got rid of a lot of the friction of having to deal with papers getting lost in terms of dealing with, all these outdated processes. Now, whenever a document is done, it shows up, right? Like you don't have to wait for someone to send it to you. Like it's just in your queue. And so I think, for a lot of lenders, they're actually not really excited about moving processors and underwriters back in house, like back into the office and back into a physical location. I think, of course, they're very interested in moving back, customer facing people back into the branches because that's really important. I think they're excited potentially about moving, different kinds of departments back in person, but there are just some departments that they're actually going to continue wanting to keep remote because they've seen so many benefits in morale, in productivity, in accuracy that they're not likely to want to snap back.
Do you think management has already reached its peak in terms of processes and information that is available for product development?
Yeah, or there are still some areas of improvement that have to be evolved in future?
So I think, product is still not at the peak of remote. And I think one of the most, how do I phrase this? One of the areas that is the most challenging is really getting to understand your end user, right? I think, in the past, product managers could sit with design teams and like go shadow a user through their physical life. And that was actually very, very valuable, right? I think now that, for one of the challenges, I think, of remote product teams is not having that very high fidelity understanding of who is the user and what is their pain. And so I think, there are potentially, applications of either, VR or AR to much better understand the user within their context, right? I think because right now, again, kind of really the only things that you can get is you can really only get like, a web recording of someone doing something. And typically that camera is in a fixed position, right? Like you don't get to see, oh, this is the room that you work in, kind of hear all the different people that you're interacting with. And like we are missing all of this very rich information. And so I definitely don't think product management is at the peak of, remote work. I don't think it's at the peak of, how to transfer information. What I do think is that, after everyone's vaccinated and after the pandemic is a lot less urgent, I expect to see that product management information flow and kind of innovation in terms of like remote working is not going to progress for a while. It's going to stay plateaued for, maybe 12 months, 18 months, as people start to fall back into those old patterns of, I want to, sit down with actual users. I want to sit down with my actual teams. But I think it's an irreversible trend, right? Because the world is becoming ever more complex. Talent is everywhere, and we kind of can't ignore that there are all of these very talented folks out there who might not be sitting physically with us. We can't possibly be flying people out to see other people all the time. And so I think, after that initial plateau where there's not going to be a lot of innovation on how do people work remotely, you'll see another wave come in where now people are starting to see, okay, well, I really want to get ahead of the game, right? Like I have all this talent that I can tap into, all of these customers that I can speak to that I'm currently not able to. How do I break into that, right? And so kind of that's the way that I see it is, right now we see, this really incredible wave of innovation in terms of, how do people interact together, work together online and remotely. We're then going to see a plateau for 12 to 18 months as people kind of fall back into those bad old patterns. But then you're going to see another renewed wave of investment. I think because then people will start to realize, wait, there are so many things that I used to have when I was working kind of more digitally that I'm no longer able to get. How can I get more of that at scale, right? How can I get a lot of the benefits that I have of co-locating myself with other people, but be able to replicate that digitally? And I think by then we'll see a lot more refinements in, networking, connectivity, VR and AR that we're going to see a lot more jumps ahead. And so kind of, I think the future of product management is still not determined. I think there's still a lot more to happen. And so we're definitely not at the peak yet.
And what are benefits for working remotely, like for you personally?
I think one of the things that is very valuable about working remotely is that you can focus a lot more of your time. You can structure a lot more of your time to better match your, let's say, your energy cycles, right? And what I mean by that is, every person has a different working pattern. Some people are a lot more productive in the day. Some people are a lot more productive in the afternoon or in the late night. People have these different patterns of, do I prefer to work in short bursts? Do I prefer to kind of work in like really long periods? And so I think, one of the challenges of being in person was that, everyone was always available, right? And so kind of you might have a colleague come up to you and say, hey, I need to talk to you about a thing. You feel bad. You don't want to let them down. And so you're like, okay, great. You get interrupted, right? You do the thing that they need you to do for 15 minutes. You come back and it's like, I just lost all my energy. I have no idea where I am anymore, right? And kind of a lot of those micro interruptions, they add up over time, right? And so even though you're able to, help others jump forward, your own output is being slowed down. And so I think one of the benefits of working remotely is everyone now has these new expectations around, one, setting your own boundaries, two, understanding other people's boundaries, and then three, respecting those boundaries and like negotiating on how can we get these different boundaries to work together if they don't overlap correctly, right? And so I think that has really enabled a lot more deep work. I think, my engineering team has very much appreciated that I don't walk by them and ask them questions anymore. Now it's, hey, Clement, this is your dedicated time to talk to me, right? And so I think that has been very valuable to them. I think same thing for design and same thing for product. I think we've had a lot more time to think through what is our strategic plan? What is our vision? What is our roadmap, right? Kind of where before you would get bounced around in all of these different, folks coming to you and saying, hey, Clement, my customer currently needs this thing, right? Can we talk about it? And then like working through that in real time. Now we have more time to see the message, right? Absorb it, think about like, where do we want to prioritize this? How does this fit into everything else? And then decide like, how do we want to engage with it? And I think that additional time in between has meant a lot more thoughtful product decisions, engineering decisions and design decisions. So I think the value of remote working for me is kind of the expectation now that you have time to understand the request and reprioritize it, kind of rather than having to do everything in real time and get distracted all the time.
So when I imagine or when I talk about product manager, I draw a picture of a person running in circles between like developers, designers, business owners, and over and over again. But as we start working more remotely, if we draw the line further in time, do you see a place for a remote product leadership as a service?
I think it depends on each company's appetite, right? And so I think, in general, a lot of organizations have to answer the question, do I want to build or buy, right? Like, do I want this thing to be in-house as my core expertise, or am I willing to buy it or partner it or whatever, right? I think, in general, a lot of kind of already established tech startups or, established large tech companies, they're going to be less likely to want to move towards outsourcing. I think because they have this historical pattern, right, of, we've worked with product managers in-house, kind of they are the source of our innovation. And so we want to continue to maintain large control over that. But I think I think for a newer wave of organizations, right, where they are starting their software development for the very first time, where they don't have the preconceived notion of, hey, I have to have a chief product officer, or hey, I have to have an in-house product manager. I think there you're going to see a lot more of that appetite of, well, how can I draw on all of this global talent that I may not have access to, right? I think one of the things that's always really, really difficult that I hear about from, my engineering friends and colleagues and my network is a lot of people are always asking, hey, I really want to create a new startup, a new idea all of my own, and I have the technical skills to do it. I just don't have a product partner to do this with, right? Like, do you know of any product managers who can like do this with me? And sometimes I'll have to say like, look, like all the PMs that I know, like they're currently employed building out products elsewhere. I don't think they're going to have the time to want to try to figure out the side project with you, right? Whereas I think, in terms of, product management as a service, I think that can be potentially really attractive for people who are looking to jump into launching their own products from scratch. And so I think kind of that is where you'll start to see that innovation begin, and then you'll see kind of this like slow adoption curve over time, right? And I think again, this really mirrors that entire trend of remote work, right? I think a lot of really large companies weren't very interested in telecommunications for the longest time. It was a lot of the really small startups who were really crunched for talent, who didn't have anyone in their network, that reached out and started saying, how can I work with people in other countries? How can I work with people in other geographies? Because I'm strapped for resources and time and network. Like, I don't know how to get started. Let me reach out to someone else who can deliver all of these things to me with their expertise at high quality and low cost, right? And so I think, and then because there was all of that innovation and kind of best practice establishment kind of from these much smaller organizations, you start to see it trickle towards the large ones until there was the forcing function of the pandemic that then forced everyone to go do it, right? And so I think you might start to see something kind of similar to this, where a lot of smaller organizations, those are the ones where there's going to be a lot more traction towards having product management as a service. I see a lot more now kind of product management consultants, where in the past, I didn't see that many of them, right? Like when I first got started in my career, I think a lot of product managers were expected to be in-house, but now I see a lot more people taking on clients that are not like, they work for themselves as product managers, and kind of they work with all these different clients like as a service. And so I think you'll see both kind of the supply of product management talent kind of move towards this more like as a service background. And you'll see, because that supply is moving, you'll also start to see the demand shift that way as well.
The last one, the last but not least. So, can you give any hints? Where do you find the passion to evolve yourself as a product manager?
So, and this is going to sound a little bit personal or vulnerable, but I'm comfortable sharing it. For me, ever since high school, my personal mission in life has to be to make other people's lives happier, easier, better, right? And so I measure that in kind of two different components. One is in terms of depth of impact, right? How much have I improved someone's life by? And the other one is breadth. How many people have I been able to help and influence? And so kind of, a lot of my drive to improve myself comes from wanting to serve other people, right? I think by learning more about product management, by forcing myself to take on harder challenges, that enables me then to share my knowledge with a lot more people and to help them in their careers. Because one of the things that I really struggled with when I first started in product management was I didn't have that many mentors. I didn't have that many colleagues who could teach me what product management was. And I see now that, across a lot of different geographies, a lot of different companies, people don't have that mentor, right? And so I want to at least give them the option of having a mentor, even if that mentor is kind of in the form of articles or podcasts or presentations, right? Like, I want to make sure that they don't feel lost, but I want to give them that knowledge. And so that means that I have to take the challenge first, right? I need to learn about how to do all of these difficult things so that then I can teach other people how to do it and they don't have to face it for the first time, right? And so I think that is what really motivates me. It is being able to provide both deep positive impact as well as that like breadth of impact to a global audience. So that's really what keeps me going. It can be difficult sometimes in terms of, not just going through the challenge of something that's very difficult, but then also then like turning it into shareable insights and like getting that to be distributed. I think that is very costly to me, but it's something that I think is really valuable to the world. And I think, is something that I'm very interested in investing in. So like, that's what really drives me to continue to improve as a product manager.
And I'm really wondering how many times you spend every day on job. So like, how many times do you spend searching new information, working, and helping people?
So I would say, it really comes down to making sure that I have a really clear schedule of when am I going to do what, right? And so I think I've had to experiment with a couple of different schedules. I think in the past, the way that I thought about it is, in the early mornings, I can mentor people, and then then I'll focus on, my full-time job. And then like in the evenings, I can get back to helping people. But I think the challenge was because of all of the mental shifts that I had to make in terms of like figure out how to abstract a concept and then figure out how to like apply it immediately for work, right? Like that was too difficult for me. And so the way that I've done it now is basically from Monday through Friday, right? Like generally the focus is going to be, how do I really excel on the job? Like as an individual contributor product manager, how do I really dig in and make sure that I'm moving problems forward? And then on weekends, I allocate 3 to 4 hours every weekend, including holidays, to trying to figure out, what is the highest impact thing that I can do to help other people, right? Is it writing an article? Is it, presenting on behalf of some organization? And making sure that I'm creating that valuable content for people so that way kind of they can continue to move forward, right? And so I think, in terms of time spent, it might sound like, hey, 3 hours on 2 days a week, right? It's only 6 hours a week. Like that's not that much time. But if you think about it, there are 50 weeks in a year, right? And so like that's something like, that's something like 300 hours that I can spend in terms of being able to provide all of this impact. And so it's a lot about investing in increments, right? And making sure that I'm doing it sustainably rather than trying to burn myself in and do everything at once. So I think kind of that schedule has been really helpful of, Monday through Friday, I focus on how do I get Blend to continue to grow? How do I grow myself as an individual contributor? And then on weekends, how do I grow as a teacher? How do I grow as a mentor for others and kind of share that knowledge for other people? And so kind of that has been very synergistic where I become a better individual contributor because of my work in mentoring others. And I become a better mentor because of my work as an individual contributor.
Okay, that was Clement Kao. Product Management HQ.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Okay, bye-bye.